So we proceed with the effects of the Nama and Herero resistances or uprising. So what were the results of the war? So after the uprising, Nama and Herero lost their cattle and land to Germans. They became very poor and lived in a severe life that could not enable to live in a conducive environment and a good life. So this is to say, loss of their cattle and land, or land alienation and the cattle confiscation. Other effect was that African communities such as Herero lost their life. Only 16,000 Herero survived out of a previous population of 18,000, whereas only 98,000 Nama were alive in 1811, compared to 20,000 people who survived in 1822. The chief township in Namibia was officially abolished by the German government. This was the other effect. Also, there was an increasing number of Germans in Namibia. For example, up to 1903, the number of Germans was about 1640, but after the war, the number increased much up to this number 14 and 1940 in 1913. Other effect was Namibia became a German colony, and the German administration continued to be strong. For this reason, the Nama and the Herero uprising did not materialize and had a very minimal effect compared to that of the Majimaji in Tanganyika. So after this war, Namibia was officially German colony. After the uprising, German government introduced the concentration camps where Africans, women and the children were grouped. In these camps, they lived in bad conditions, hence many of them died of famine and a very cruel condition of forced labor. So these were the main effects of Nama and the Herero resistance. And then after, we have to check general causes of the African resistances, or major factors or causes for the African resistance. Since we have already discussed the all small scale and large scale resistances, so now let us check with causes, general causes of African resistance. So there were 4 major causes of African reaction to the colonial rule. This includes the following. One was colonial economy or economic factor, and here we have land alienation, whereby Africans' arable fertile land was taken by the colonialists and they became landless. So all Africans' fertile land were taken by colonialists and the Africans remained landless. So the land was the major livelihood of Africa. It was grabbed from them and distributed to the white settlers and colonial state plantation as to reduce the Africans to mere supplies of cheap labor to the colonial plantation. So because of colonial economy and particularly land alienation made Africans to react. Other colonial economy factor was imposition of taxation by the colonialists. From 1898, head tax was laid on all adult Africans in the colony of Tanganyika. At least 1 year for its equivalent, this amounted to at least a month's wage of the white-owned. That is to say, imposition of taxation system. And there were different forms of taxation system, whereby later on other taxes like heart tax gun tax, matiti tax, aimed to forcing Africans to provide cheap labor to the colonialists. And the major factor for imposing tax was to force Africans to work for Europeans or colonialist farms. So Africans started to oppose against this form of taxation. Other point was about cattle confiscation, so as to break the backbone of African economy and to be forced to integrate into capitalist economy. So African society, who were pastoralists, that depend much on cattle for their livelihood, people like Herero, Masai, Sukuma, their cattle were confiscated. So because of this, then people decided to change against the colonialists, since they claimed that colonialists were not fair for them. Also, forced labor and forced cropping. Africans were forced to produce cash crops and also forced to provide cheap labor, for example, and this was done through different systems or policies. For example, Kipande system in Kenya. This in places where production did not exist migrant laborers was carried out. The adult men are to move in the areas of production where only subsistence wage was provided. Accommodation is provided for only one person. The work's family was there for to remain at home in some far off. So in here, colonialists introduced different policies which made Africans to work in them. And you can see in Kenya, they introduced the Kipande system. And this, they were given ID or identity card that allocated or shown that a such person has attained to a farm or to the job at that day. And for those who were not, they were harshly punished. Then they have to go to work for the European farms. So all these were made in order to force them to work for colonial farms. So because of forced labor, then Africans were tired and decided to react against the colonialists. Other economic point was provision of low wages of Africans who worked on European farms, mines, and office. So the major aim was to bring the self-sufficient African rural economy. It was no longer enough for the family to feed, clothes, and the house itself, and on top of that, cash was to be found to pay taxes regardless of the family's income. So provision of low wages. They were low paid, not depending or comparing with the family needs or demands. So this made them to live in a miserable life, in a bad life condition. So this made them to start reacting or fighting against the colonialists. So these were economic issues or causes. Let us now check on political causes or political issues. So politically, African local rulers were thrown from their administration and lost control of their people and independence in general, whereby the colonialists established the notorious colonial rule, thus resistance to the colonial rule. So this was African local rulers were thrown from their administration system. They were removed from their political system or from political place or position, leadership position, and those positions were taken by the colonialists or colonial control. So this made them to fight against the colonialists so that they could return their leadership position. Also, Africans lost their control over their trade, that they controlled and benefited from them. So colonialists established the so-called legitimate trade, which isolated African traders like Abushiri and Bwana Heri, who lost control of trade at the coast. Judge of Opobo of the Niger, the Mandika Sanor, all these resistance were prepared or were advocated to regain their trade control. So because of the loss of their trade control led to African resistances. Africans lost their control over their trade that we have already discussed. Again, destruction of African agriculture, which led to the problem of hunger and famine. The colonialists opened cash crops plantation, hence resistances. So Africans were forced to cultivate such crops in the agricultural system, while the Africans had their own farming system. So because of this led to the African resistances, or African decided to resist it so that they could be free from those political issues. Other factor was colonial injustice and oppression. Colonial oppression and injustice, and this was based on corporal punishment like caning of the lazy Africans. But not only lazy Africans. In most cases, those Africans were caned, were punished, and others were killed and hanged on the public. That is to say, they sent the lessons to other Africans who had the same aim of opposing the colonial control. So because of that, led Africans to react. Destruction of African culture and the introduction of Western culture. This also led Africans to resist. Racism and the segregation of Africans. Racism and the segregation of Africans. For example, in South Africa, they introduced the apartheid policy, which showed the differences existed between Africans and whites, by which there was blacks residents and whites residents. There was blacks roads and whites roads. There were blacks hospitals and African hospitals. So all these Africans shown or seemed to be unfair to them. That's why they decided to fight effectively. Hence African resistances. As well as intimidation and the violence to the Africans. Africans were not lived freely. Fear and insecurity. Every time they felt like colonialists were there. So because of this, made Africans to fight against the colonialists. So these were major factors of African resistances. Let us finish with objectives. Objectives of colonial, that is the African resistances. Objectives of African resistances. So the following are the objectives of African resistances. One was to gain independence and their sovereignty. This had been taken away by colonialists. Since colonialists, once they came in Africa, they took African independence and sovereignty. So by doing so, Africans were not aware. That's why they decided to fight against the colonialists so that to regain their independence and the sovereignty that had been taken away by colonialists. Another objective of African resistance was to maintain peace and order in their society, which they had experienced before the coming of colonialists. Before the colonial time, Africans lived peacefully, in peace and order. So they lived peacefully life. They enjoyed their life. They enjoyed their production, their activities at all. but after the coming of colonialists, since those things have changed, that's why they just wanted to retain their peace and order, and they just wanted to experience life which they lived before the coming of colonialists. Another objective was to pursue and maintain African freedom which prevailed before the coming of colonizers. So they just wanted to pursue and maintain their freedom which experienced before the coming of colonizers. Africans had their own freedom, which they had before the coming of colonizers. So they also aimed to gain that freedom which they had. Other objective was to retain African self-sustaining economy, which was based on subsistence agriculture. So they just wanted to retain African self-sustaining economy, which had profitable to Africans and not colonialists. So after Africans revealed that this new agricultural system which introduced by colonialists had to fill the colonial interest, now Africans objected to resist or objected to regain or retain their sustaining economy, which was based on sustainable agriculture. Other objective was to fight and get rid of foreign domination of Europeans, to make them go back to their home countries. They just wanted to decolonize themselves from the colonial hands, from the colonial control. Since colonialists, once they came in Africa, they did things which were not fair to Africans. That's why Africans wanted to remove them, turn them back to their countries. So this, by doing so, we say Africans objected to remove them. Also, to fight and get rid of foreign domination that we have already discussed, to avoid humiliation and subjugation done by the foreigners. Since once colonialists came in Africa, they humiliated indigenous or native Africans. They subjugated those Africans. So that's why Africa wanted to avoid that humiliation, subjugation done by foreigners. Minerals, land, as well as their cattle. And by that time, African economy based on cattle. They much based or depend on cattle, especially those pastoralist societies. So once those land and cattle were taken by colonialists, then Africans wanted to regain their lost land and cattle. And the other objective was to establish African trade. This had been overthrown by slave trade and the so-called legitimate trade. So they just wanted to regain or to retain their lost trade. Since they lost their trade to colonialists or to colonial hand, and this trade was replaced by slave trade, and later on the legitimate trade. This was an equal exchange. For example, Africans had to pay minerals while they were given all the clothes, they were given personal gifts like a trouser, a shirt, t-shirt, and other clothes. So because of this, African wanted to regain their trade. So this is the end of our topic, that is colonialism. Welcome to other topics, but I must give you a lot of thanks for being with me from the beginning of our topic up to the end. But there is a task here, that is Task 1, it discuss the main causes of African resistances, and task 2 is question 2, discuss the main significances of African resistance. What are the significances of African resistances? So this marks to the end of our topic. Thank you for other topics or for other history sessions. It is me, Sandenan from Edukea Company. Thank you. Bye-bye.